People often mistake tolerance for permission. They convince themselves that just because you don't immediately react to a minor boundary violation, that boundary simply no longer exists. This psychological trap is exactly how a standard property line dispute with an entitled neighbor escalated into the construction of a permanent, 12-foot, commercial-grade nightmare. I didn't want to build a fortress. I just wanted to drink my morning coffee in peace. But to understand how we reached a point where I essentially erased a grown man's entire backyard ecosystem, you have to go back to the beginning. It all started 3 years ago. I had just bought a house on Willow Creek Lane. I thought the best thing I was getting was peace and quiet. The mortgage was somehow lower than my old apartment rent, the garage was oversized, and the neighborhood was deeply established. But the real luxury wasn't the house itself. It was the view. My backyard happened to be the only lot on the entire street with a completely unobstructed sight line to a small, pristine lake tucked behind the neighborhood greenbelt. Every morning, I would sit outside with a fresh cup of coffee and just watch the sunlight hit the water. It wasn't a private lake. Anybody could walk around it. But from my property, framed by the mature trees, it looked like a private postcard. The guy next door, however, seemed to think that postcard belonged exclusively to him. His name was Brent. Brent was one of those neighbors who never officially crossed the line initially, but somehow always managed to stand directly on top of it, heavily breathing on your personal space. The first week I moved in, he wandered into my backyard without asking. He didn't introduce himself first. He just strolled over, hands in his pockets, to check out the view. The second week, he leaned over the invisible property line and suggested I trim several of my own trees because they partially blocked his angle from his patio. The third week, he casually mentioned that it was kind of selfish for one homeowner to have the best view in the neighborhood. I laughed. I genuinely assumed he was making a dry, neighborly joke. Looking back through the lens of human behavior, I don't think he was joking at all. He was testing the waters. He was probing my defenses to see what kind of homeowner I was going to be. About 6 months after moving in, I hired a professional contractor to build a 6-foot, solid cedar privacy fence along our shared property line. I didn't do this maliciously. I didn't even do it entirely because of Brent. I simply liked privacy, and I wanted to secure my yard. The survey markers were officially verified. The permits were filed with the city. Everything was done by the book. The fence sat completely, undeniably, on my property. Brent hated it immediately. He complained over the top of it that it ruined the open feeling between our yards. He complained that it blocked the natural summer breezes. He complained that it wasn't a very neighborly thing to do. What he never directly admitted, though it was glaringly obvious, was that my fence completely blocked his ability to sit on his patio and stare straight through my backyard at the lake. For almost 2 years, things stayed relatively quiet. The fence did its job. Then, one Saturday afternoon, I stepped outside carrying a heavy bag of charcoal for my grill. I took 3 steps into the grass and stopped dead in my tracks. One entire section of my 6-foot cedar fence wasn't closed anymore. It had been physically unlatched, folded backward on its hinges, and firmly propped open with a heavy landscaping brick. For a split second, my brain went into security mode. I honestly thought somebody had broken into my yard. Then, I looked through the gap. I noticed 2 patio chairs. They were positioned directly on Brent's side of the property line, perfectly and meticulously aligned with the new opening in my fence. Both chairs faced straight toward the lake. Sitting snugly next to them was a small metal side table holding 2 iced drinks. And there, attached securely to one of my wooden fence posts with thick plastic zip ties, was a Bluetooth speaker softly playing classic rock. I just stood there on the grass, holding a bag of charcoal, staring through the gap, trying to process the sheer audacity of what I was looking at. The longer I looked at the setup, the more ridiculous and calculated it became. This wasn't some accident. This wasn't wind damage from a storm. This wasn't a loose metal latch. Somebody had intentionally modified my property to create a custom viewing window. Right on cue, Brent stepped outside his back door holding a cold beer. He looked at me standing there. He looked at the massive opening in my fence. And he smiled. He smiled like everything happening was completely normal and acceptable. I dropped the charcoal. Why is my fence open? He shrugged. He actually rolled his shoulders and shrugged. We were just enjoying the lake. I kept my voice entirely flat. I asked him why my physical property had been modified without my permission. He took a slow sip of his beer, letting out a relaxed sigh. Come on, man. Relax. We're just borrowing the view. It's not like you own the water. I remember standing there, looking at this man, realizing I had just encountered a level of psychological entitlement so deeply rooted, so incredibly impressive, it almost deserved a trophy. I didn't yell. I didn't argue the legalities of property boundaries. I didn't say a single word. I simply walked over to the property line. I bent down, picked up the heavy landscaping brick, and tossed it into the grass. I grabbed the heavy cedar panel, folded it firmly shut, and secured the metal latch. Then, I pulled a pocket knife from my jeans, cut the thick plastic zip ties holding the speaker to my post, and handed the device back over the top of the wood. "Don't touch my fence again." His relaxed smile vanished instantly. Not because he suddenly felt a pang of guilt, but because he looked genuinely, deeply annoyed that I wasn't cooperating with his delusion. I turned around and went inside, figuring the message had been delivered with absolute clarity. I honestly thought folding the fence back and removing his little viewing window was the end of it. I assumed a grown man would take the hint. I was dead wrong. The real audacity started exactly a week later, just as the sun went down. It was a Saturday evening. The air was cooling down, and I was inside reading when I started hearing voices bleeding through the walls. It wasn't just Brent. It was a lot of voices. Laughter, clinking glass, loud conversation. When I opened my back door and stepped onto my patio, I found a scene that somehow managed to be even more unbelievable than the Bluetooth speaker incident. Brent was hosting a dinner party. There were 7 or 8 nicely dressed guests sitting in a long row of folding chairs. And those chairs were lined up squarely beside the exact same section of my cedar fence. The panel had been forced open again, but he hadn't just opened it this time. He had upgraded the installation. Warm yellow string lights were delicately threaded through my wooden fence posts, illuminating the gap. Thick orange extension cords snaked across the dirt, completely crossing the legal property line into my yard to power a larger sound system. The entire setup looked like some kind of exclusive outdoor theater, and the screen was the lake beyond my grass. One woman, wearing a light sweater and holding a delicate glass of white wine, actually looked through the gap, made direct eye contact with me, and smiled. She raised her glass and waved. Another guest, a man in a polo shirt, turned to Brent and said loudly, "You have such an amazing view back here, Brent." That was the exact moment the final piece of the psychological puzzle clicked into place. I realized I had been analyzing the situation incorrectly. Brent hadn't misunderstood property boundaries. He wasn't confused about where his land ended and mine began. He understood the lines perfectly well. He simply did not care. In his mind, because he possessed a strong desire for something, he had already justified the act of taking it. Standing there in the shadows of my patio, watching a group of complete strangers use my personal, privately funded fence as a community-owned observation deck, I realized this situation was rapidly mutating. It was no longer about a view of the water. This is where a lot of standard neighborhood disputes go completely sideways. People often operate under the dangerous assumption that if an action feels relatively harmless, it must also be legal. But that is fundamentally not how property law, or human nature, works. From a purely analytical standpoint, Brent wasn't just borrowing a view. He was actively interfering with a physical structure that sat entirely, legally, and permanently on another homeowner's property. He was trespassing on the structure itself. But honestly, the legal violation wasn't even the most fascinating part to me. The psychology driving it was. Once an entitled individual gets away with a minor violation, their brain rewires the interaction. They immediately start treating the violation like an inherent right instead of a stolen privilege. The first time they cross the line, they are testing your reaction. The second time, they assume the line has been erased. And judging by the catered dinner party currently happening next door, Brent had fully convinced himself that my cedar fence was basically a shared neighborhood amenity. What he completely failed to realize, wrapped up in his own arrogance, was that he had just handed me every single piece of evidence I would ever need to dismantle his reality. I didn't storm across the yard. I didn't scream at his guests to get off my fence. I didn't call the local police to report a noise complaint or a minor trespass. Doing any of that would have instantly painted me as the unstable, angry neighbor ruining a nice evening. It would have given Brent the exact narrative he wanted. Instead, I stepped back into the shadows. I pulled out my phone, wiped the camera lens clean, and started meticulously documenting the scene. I zoomed in and took crystal clear photographs of the unlatched panel. I photographed the heavy orange extension cords physically crossing the property boundary. I got close-up shots of the string lights securely fastened to my wooden posts. I captured the long row of folding chairs positioned to look through my property. I documented the entire unauthorized modification from multiple angles. The funny thing about people who believe the rules don't apply to them is that they almost always make one critical, fatal mistake. They become careless. They stop hiding their bad behavior because they have convinced themselves they are morally justified. That dinner party wasn't just an annoying Saturday night. It was an airtight evidentiary portfolio. The next morning, I brewed a pot of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop. By lunchtime, I had uploaded every single photograph into the Homeowners Association's official portal. I drafted a cold, purely factual, emotionless formal complaint. I didn't use the word annoying. I used terms like unauthorized structural modification, trespassing on private installations, and liability risk. Finally, I attached a high-resolution PDF copy of my original, stamped property survey from when the fence was first installed. I clicked submit, figuring I would have to wait a week or two for the slow wheels of neighborhood bureaucracy to do what bureaucracy does. Instead, my phone rang less than 48 hours later. It was the property manager for the HOA. She had reviewed the stamped survey, compared it against the master neighborhood records, and determined a very simple, undeniable fact. The fence was mine. Entirely mine. It was not a partially shared boundary fence. It was not sitting on a neutral property line. It was not subject to any kind of community access easement. It was my private property. The representative asked me a few clarifying questions about the attachments. When I calmly described the heavy wooden panel being repeatedly forced open, the zip ties, and the electrical cords threaded through the wood, there was a long, heavy pause on the phone. Finally, her professional tone broke, and she just said, "He's doing what?" That was the moment I felt a wave of cold satisfaction. Sometimes, when you are stuck inside a bizarre conflict for months, you start questioning your own sanity. You wonder if maybe you really are being too sensitive or unreasonable. Then, you explain the raw facts to a neutral, third-party professional, and they respond with absolute, unvarnished disbelief. That is usually a pretty solid indicator that you are not the problem. The HOA hit him with a 14-day compliance notice, a certified letter demanding immediate removal of his attachments, a repair of any structural damage, and a hefty fine for unauthorized property tampering. Most rational people would take the loss, pay the penalty, and quietly retreat into their homes. But Brent? He marched straight up to my front door that very evening, completely unaware of the absolute monster of a project I was already planning. I opened my front door. Brent was standing on my porch, clutching the crumpled certified letter in his right hand. His face was flushed, tight with a mixture of disbelief and misplaced righteous indignation. The relaxed, beer-sipping neighbor from the previous weekend was completely gone. His first sentence wasn't an apology. It wasn't an inquiry. It was a demand. "Did you seriously report me?" I didn't invite him inside. I didn't step out onto the porch. I just stood in the doorway, looked at the crumpled paper in his hand, and gave him a single, flat syllable. "Yes." He stared at me like I had just committed an act of profound betrayal. This is the fascinating climax of the entitlement cycle. When a person who believes they are above the rules is finally confronted by them, they never experience an epiphany. They experience victimization. He genuinely felt that my refusal to let him dismantle my property was an attack on his personal freedom. Then came the barrage of excuses. He claimed I was blowing a simple misunderstanding out of proportion. He claimed everybody in the neighborhood enjoyed looking at the lake. He claimed I was creating a toxic environment and unnecessary tension. And then, he delivered his closing argument. The exact same line he had used before. "Nobody owns a view." I let the silence hang in the evening air for a long moment. I let him hear the crickets. I wanted him to feel the absolute lack of emotional reaction on my end. "You're right," I said calmly. "Nobody owns a view. But I do own the fence." He opened his mouth to reply, but the words died in his throat. He had no counter-argument for physical reality. The official HOA notice required him to remove every single attachment, repair any damage, and pay a substantial fine within 14 days. More importantly, it required a signed, written acknowledgement from him that the physical structure belonged exclusively to me. The look on his face when his brain finally processed that he could not charm, bully, or gaslight his way out of a legally binding document was worth every second of frustration I had endured. He turned around and walked back down my driveway. But here is the truth about boundary analysis. I knew the underlying problem wasn't actually solved. Brent hadn't suddenly developed a deep respect for property rights. He had simply been forced into temporary compliance. The resentment was still brewing. The sheer, obsessive desire for that lake view was still there. As long as the temptation existed just on the other side of a 6-foot cedar panel, it was only a matter of time before he tested the perimeter again. You cannot negotiate a person out of a mindset they didn't reason themselves into. I decided it was time to permanently remove the opportunity. A week later, I scheduled a meeting with a high-end landscaping and structural contractor named Marcus. We walked the property line together. I showed him the survey markers. I pointed out the modified fence panel, and I explained the psychological profile of the man living next door. Halfway through my explanation, Marcus started smiling. By the end, he was openly laughing. He looked at my fence, then looked over at Brent's carefully arranged patio furniture. "So, you want to make sure he never sees that water through your yard again?" "I want to make sure he forgets what water looks like," I replied. Over the next 3 days, we developed a master plan. Technically, I could have just reinforced the wooden panels, added heavy padlocks, or installed security cameras. But that would only address the unauthorized access. I wanted to completely eradicate the incentive. We designed a 12-foot privacy screen extending along the most critical section of the shared boundary. Heavy-duty, commercial-grade steel posts, deeply poured concrete footings, dark, opaque, architectural-grade paneling. It was perfectly compliant with local city ordinances for internal yard structures and fully approved by the HOA guidelines. Completely legal, completely permanent. But the steel screen was only layer 1. Layer 2 was psychological warfare via botany. We ordered a dense row of green giant Arborvitae to be planted tightly on my side of the new screen. On installation day, each tree stood roughly 6 feet tall. According to Marcus, with the right soil and watering schedule, they would grow at an aggressive rate, eventually creating a towering, impenetrable natural wall of thick greenery. When the heavy machinery arrived on a Tuesday morning, the reality of the situation finally hit Brent. The first flatbed truck rumbled down the street. By noon, my backyard was a construction zone. Workers were running string lines, operating loud post-hole diggers, and setting heavy steel into the earth. The smell of excavated dirt and wet concrete filled the air. Around lunchtime, I saw Brent marching across his grass. He stopped right at the invisible boundary line. "What exactly is all this?" he demanded, raising his voice over the sound of a diesel engine. Marcus paused what he was doing and looked at me. I looked at Marcus. Then I looked at Brent. "Landscaping." Brent stared at the massive, industrial steel posts being lowered into the deep holes. The sheer scale of the materials was impossible to ignore. "That seems incredibly excessive," he muttered. I almost reminded him that cutting viewing windows into someone else's private property with a pocket knife was also considered excessive. But I didn't. There was no point in arguing with a man who was currently watching his delusion get buried under 3 feet of wet concrete. The project continued for the rest of the week. Every single day, another massive steel panel went up. Every single day, a little more of the horizon vanished from his perspective. By Friday afternoon, the transformation was absolute. What had once been an open, breezy sight line was now violently interrupted by a towering, opaque barrier, backed by a tightly packed row of young, aggressive evergreen trees. The truly beautiful part wasn't the immediate blockage. It was the biological promise of the future. Those Arborvitae weren't staying 6 feet tall. They were going to grow and expand and thicken. Nature itself was acting as my long-term security contractor. A few days later, the 14-day HOA deadline arrived. Brent had absolutely no choice but to comply. I stood in my kitchen, holding a cup of coffee, watching through the window as he systematically dismantled his own viewing party. It was a quiet, pathetic display. He stood out there in the afternoon sun, pulling the delicate string lights out of the wood. He took a pair of scissors and snipped the zip ties. He rolled up the heavy orange extension cords. At one point, he just stood there holding the small Bluetooth speaker in his hand, staring up at the 12 feet of cold steel blocking out the sky. The irony was heavy enough to weigh down a ship. For months, he had treated my property like it existed solely for his convenience. Now, he was being legally compelled to clean up the evidence of his own entitlement, completely walled off from the prize he thought he deserved. He submitted his written apology. He paid his fine. Officially, the dispute was closed. But the real, silent victory happened several months later. One crisp evening, I walked outside onto my patio. The Arborvitae had already gained noticeable height and thickness. The dark privacy screen blended seamlessly into the deep green foliage, looking like a natural, immovable part of the earth. I glanced over the boundary line toward Brent's property. His patio furniture was still there. The 2 chairs, the small side table. They were perfectly aligned. They were still pointed directly toward the exact spot where the lake used to be visible. Except now, there was absolutely nothing to see. Just a massive, solid, towering wall of green. A man sitting in those chairs would literally be staring at leaves. It remains one of the most unintentionally hilarious psychological portraits I have ever witnessed. The chairs remained. The view was dead. And for the first time since I signed the mortgage on that house, the conflict was entirely finished. Not because somebody won a screaming match. Not because somebody finally saw the error of their ways and changed their personality. The conflict ended because the physical opportunity to repeat the bad behavior had been permanently erased from the map. Sometimes, justice doesn't arrive with a dramatic courtroom speech or a cinematic apology. Sometimes, justice looks like a grown man sitting alone on his patio, drinking a beer, and staring blankly at 12 feet of commercial-grade landscaping that he personally inspired. Looking back now, I realize the lake was never the actual issue. If you asked Brent today, he would probably still complain to anyone who would listen that his evil neighbor stole a view. But from where I sit, the view was just the catalyst. The real conflict was always about boundaries. Physical boundaries, legal boundaries, and most importantly, personal boundaries. Neighborhood disputes almost never begin with someone waking up and deciding to become a villain. They begin with a tiny, seemingly harmless act of entitlement that goes unchallenged. A tire parked slightly over a driveway line. A borrowed tool that never gets returned. A rule that gets ignored because their specific situation feels special. Then, inch by inch, that behavior expands. They mistake your tolerance for permission. The first time Brent touched my fence, I handled it quietly because I genuinely believed we could operate like reasonable adults. He interpreted that quietness as weakness. He interpreted basic courtesy as consent. That is why I firmly believe that establishing hard, immovable boundaries is actually the most neighborly thing you can do. Clear expectations prevent slow-burning resentment. Good rules do not create conflict. They prevent it by eliminating ambiguity. Everybody knows exactly where they stand, and everybody knows exactly what belongs to whom. The chaos only starts when someone decides those lines are optional. Once a person convinces themselves they are morally justified to take what isn't theirs, logic becomes useless. You cannot argue with entitlement. The smartest solution isn't trying to win the debate. The smartest solution is redesigning the environment so the debate no longer matters. The steel and the trees didn't teach my neighbor respect, but they did create a physical reality where my peace of mind was no longer dependent on his cooperation. And that made all the difference in the world. Today, when I sit outside with my morning coffee, the sunrise still reflects perfectly off the water. The breeze still moves through the trees. The only thing that has changed is that I get to enjoy it without ever wondering if someone is about to turn my backyard into a community observation deck. Protecting your physical property does not make you selfish. Defending your peace of mind does not make you unreasonable. Sometimes, the absolute most respectful thing you can do for yourself is calmly and permanently enforce a boundary before someone else decides it no longer exists. So now, I have to ask you, if you were standing in my shoes, how long would you have waited before making that phone call to the contractor? Would you have called the HOA after the very first incident, or would you have handled the dinner party differently? Let me know in the comments, because I have a feeling the psychology of this situation is going to divide people right down the middle.